A farmer recovering from a stroke hears strange cries coming from his cornfield at dawn. When he investigates, he finds 3 babies lying eerily quiet in the soil, wrapped in blankets with angel wings beneath them. But it's the blood-stained note beside them that makes him fall to his knees. These are miracles, but miracles come at a cost. What cost could be so great that someone would abandon these babies in his field? And why does the danger seem to be closing in on him and his estranged daughter as they try to protect them? Don't miss this powerful, heart-stopping story of family, sacrifice, and the fight to save innocent lives. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The old clock on Ben's nightstand clicked steadily in the darkness, its hands pointing to 4:30 a.m. The quiet of the early morning wrapped around his modest farmhouse like a familiar blanket, until something unusual cut through the silence. Faint cries, barely audible, drifted through his partially open window, followed by strange rustling sounds from the direction of his cornfield. The sound was different from the usual nighttime noises, the hooting of owls or the distant barking of neighborhood dogs. Ben's eyes snapped open. He lay still in his bed, listening intently. The stroke he'd suffered 3 months ago had left him more cautious, more aware of his limitations. But those sounds, they didn't seem right for this time of day. His farmer's instincts, honed over decades of working this land, told him something was off. "Probably just those darn raccoons again," he muttered, his voice rough from sleep. But something in those distant cries made his heart beat faster. They seemed almost human. With effort, Ben pushed himself up to sitting position. His left side felt heavy and uncooperative, as it had since the stroke. He reached for his cane with his good hand and flicked on the bedside lamp. Warm light spilled across his weathered face, highlighting the deep creases around his eyes and the silver that had long since taken over his hair. Should just let it be, he grumbled to himself, but he was already reaching for the flashlight he kept in his drawer. His daughter Ellen always told him to be careful, to call for help instead of investigating things on his own. Her worried face flashed in his mind, but he pushed the thought away. Old habits die hard when you've spent your whole life taking care of problems yourself. Ben shuffled to his back door, his movements slow but determined. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he made his way through the familiar darkness of his home. When he opened the door, the fog rolled in like a living thing, cool and damp against his skin. He'd thrown on his old flannel robe over his pajamas, but the morning chill still made him shiver. The air smelled of wet earth and corn silk. The beam of his flashlight cut through the fog as he made his way toward the cornfield. The tall stalks loomed ahead, creating dark shadows in the pre-dawn gloom. Those cries were clearer now, and they didn't sound like any animal he'd ever heard on his farm. His heart thumped harder with each step. His bad leg dragged slightly as he moved between the rows of corn, following the sounds. The soft earth beneath his feet made walking harder, and he had to pause several times to catch his breath. Dew-covered leaves brushed against his robe as he pushed forward. Then, as he rounded a bend in the row, his flashlight beam fell on something that made him freeze in place. There, nestled in the dark soil between the corn stalks, lay 3 small bundles. White blankets, pristine despite their surroundings, wrapped around tiny forms. Ben's hand trembled as he lowered himself carefully to his knees beside them, his joints protesting the movement. "Good Lord above," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold morning air. 3 babies, impossibly peaceful, lay before him. Each wore a white onesie, and as Ben gently touched one of the blankets, he noticed the delicate angel wings stitched onto the back of their clothing. They were so still, so quiet now, that for a terrifying moment he feared the worst. But then one of them moved, tiny fingers flexing in sleep. Their faces were perfect, untouched by the world's troubles. Something caught his eye, a white envelope partially buried in the soil beside them. Dark stains marked its surface, and Ben's stomach clenched when he realized what they were. Blood. With trembling fingers, he picked up the envelope and opened it, the paper crackling in the stillness. The note inside was brief, written in hurried strokes. "These are miracles, but miracles come at a cost. Keep them safe, for their fate depends on you." The ink was smeared in places, as if written in haste or through tears. Ben's flashlight swept the area, revealing tire tracks that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously at the field's edge. The fog swirled around him as he looked down at the 3 sleeping infants, his heart pounding with fear and something else, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of when Ellen was small, when every threat to her had seemed like a mountain to overcome. "All right, little ones," he said softly, his voice shaking. "Let's get you somewhere warm." With careful movements, he gathered them up one by one. It was slow work with his bad side, but he managed, cradling them close to his chest. As he turned back toward his house, the fog began to thin slightly, revealing the first hints of dawn. The sky was turning from black to deep purple, promising another day, though Ben knew this day would be unlike any other he'd ever faced. The morning sun streamed through Ben's living room windows, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. He'd placed a faded blue quilt, one his wife had made years ago, on the floor, carefully arranging the 3 babies in a row. From his old armchair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests, he watched them with a mixture of wonder and concern. The morning light caught the dust motes floating in the air, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that made the whole situation feel even more surreal. "Well now," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "What am I supposed to do with you little ones?" His voice echoed slightly in the quiet room, reminding him how long it had been since these walls had heard regular conversation. The babies lay quietly, their eyes wide and alert. Ben had never seen infants so calm, so still. It wasn't natural. His daughter Ellen had been a fussy baby, always demanding attention with her powerful lungs. These 3 barely made a sound, their identical expressions eerily peaceful. His stomach growled, reminding him that the babies probably needed feeding too. With effort, he pushed himself up from his chair, his left leg still stiff from the stroke. The familiar ache shot through his hip as he limped toward the kitchen. In the kitchen, he found an old baby bottle in the back of a drawer, a forgotten relic from when Ellen's kids had visited years ago. He washed it thoroughly, his hands trembling slightly as he worked, the hot water turning his knuckles pink. "Milk's all I've got," he said to himself, warming some in a pot on the stove. "Hope that'll do for now." The sweet smell of warming milk filled the kitchen, bringing back memories of early mornings with Ellen. Taking turns, he fed each baby. They accepted the bottles without fuss, their eyes never leaving his face. The whole time, that unsettling calm remained. No squirming, no crying, just those unwavering stares that seemed far too knowing for newborns. Their tiny hands clutched at the bottles with surprising strength. Later, while the babies napped, Ben made his way back to the cornfield. The morning fog had burned away, revealing clear tire tracks cutting through his crops. The damaged stalks swayed in the light breeze, marking the path of the mysterious vehicle. He followed them, noting how they led straight to where he'd found the babies. But at the edge of his property, the tracks simply stopped, as if the vehicle had vanished into thin air. The corn beyond stood perfectly undisturbed. "Don't make a lick of sense," he mumbled, scratching his chin. A crow called overhead, making him jump slightly. Back inside, Ben spent the afternoon tending to the baby's needs as best he could. He fashioned diapers from old cloth napkins and cleaned them with warm water, his farmer's hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate task. Through it all, the warning note weighed heavy on his mind. These are miracles, but miracles come at a cost. The words seemed to grow more ominous with each passing hour. The sun was setting when the phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the quiet house. Ben reached for the receiver, his hand hesitating for just a moment before picking it up. The plastic felt cold against his palm. "Hello? Forget what you saw," a low voice growled. "Or you'll regret it." The menace in those words sent a chill down Ben's spine. The line went dead before Ben could respond. His heart pounding, he dropped the receiver back into its cradle. Moving as quickly as his weakened body would allow, he began checking every window and door in the house. He tested each lock twice, drew all the curtains, and turned on every outside light he had. The familiar creaks of his old farmhouse now seemed threatening rather than comforting. Finally, exhausted from his efforts, Ben sank back into his armchair. The crumpled note lay in his lap, and the 3 babies slept peacefully on their quilt, their little chests rising and falling in perfect unison. The angel wings stitched on their onesies seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, catching the golden glow of dusk. Ben's arthritic fingers traced the words on the note again and again, the paper growing softer with each pass. He was no stranger to hard work or responsibility. He'd run this farm for 40 years before his stroke. But this was different. These babies, whoever they were, needed him. And despite his fear, despite his limitations, he knew he couldn't let them down. Something deep inside him had awakened, a protective instinct he thought had died with his wife. "Don't you worry," he whispered to the sleeping infants. "Old Ben's got you now." His voice quavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty, but his jaw was set with determination. Outside, the security lights cast long shadows across his front yard, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the growing darkness. The morning light filtered through Ben's kitchen curtains as he stood at the stove, his movements slow and careful as he cracked eggs into a pan. Dark circles shadowed his eyes after a night of constant worry and checking on the babies. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion as he reached for the salt. The toast popped up with a startling clang, making him jump. Through the window, he caught the flash of a silver sedan pulling into his gravel driveway. The familiar crunch of tires made his stomach tighten. When the car door slammed, he shuffled toward the front door, his steps unsteady from lack of sleep. His heart pounded with each step, knowing the confrontation that was coming. Ben opened the door to find Ellen standing there, her brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a crisp blue blouse and dress pants. Her expression was a mixture of concern and frustration, one he'd seen too many times before. She clutched her leather work bag tightly, her knuckles white with tension. "Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Mrs. Johnson called me, said you've been acting strange. She saw you carrying baby supplies into the house yesterday." Before Ben could respond, a baby's soft coo drifted from the living room. Ellen's eyes widened, and she pushed past him into the house, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "What was that?" She stopped abruptly at the sight of the 3 babies on the quilt, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep. "Dad, what's going on here? Whose babies are these?" "It's complicated," Ben said, his voice gruff. He shifted his weight, leaning against the doorframe, feeling every one of his 63 years. "I'm handling it." "Handling it?" Ellen's professional demeanor took over as she knelt beside the babies, checking them over with practiced movements. "These infants need proper care. We need to call the authorities right now." "No!" Ben's voice came out sharper than intended, echoing in the quiet house. "We can't do that." "Why not?" Ellen stood, crossing her arms, her social worker instincts clearly on high alert. "This isn't like you, Dad. First you shut everyone out after Mom died, and now this. What aren't you telling me?" The old pain flickered across Ben's face, making the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. There was a note and a phone call. Someone threatened. "Threatened what?" Ellen interrupted, her voice rising. "This is exactly why we need to involve the police. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking just fine," Ben insisted, his jaw set stubbornly. His fingers gripped the doorframe tighter. "These babies were left in my care for a reason." Ellen moved to the kitchen, grabbing her phone from her bag. "I'm calling this in. You can't just—" "Ellen, please." The desperation in Ben's voice made her pause. "They said the babies would be in danger if I told anyone. I can't risk that." She stared at him for a long moment, then tucked her phone away with obvious reluctance. "Fine. Then I'm staying to help. You clearly can't handle this alone." Without waiting for his response, Ellen marched upstairs to the spare room. Ben could hear her opening closets and moving furniture, the sounds of drawers being pulled open and shut with determined force. She came back down moments later, her face set with purpose. "We'll need supplies," she announced, pulling out a small notepad from her bag. "And that room needs cleaning before we can set up any kind of nursery." She gave Ben a pointed look. "You can tell me everything while we work. Every single detail." Ben watched his daughter take charge, her efficiency both familiar and painful. It reminded him of her mother, especially the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused. He stood in the doorway, feeling uncertain as Ellen began clearing out the spare room, her movements quick and decisive. The unspoken tensions between them hung heavy in the air, years of distance and hurt stretching between them like an invisible wall, but neither seemed ready to address them just yet. The soft sounds of the baby's breathing filled the silence between father and daughter. Sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows as Ellen took charge of the morning routine. Her social worker instincts kicked in as she organized supplies and created a feeding schedule on a notepad, carefully timing each meal and nap. The babies remained oddly quiet, their big eyes following her movements around the room with an unsettling awareness that made her skin prickle. "They need proper care, Dad," Ellen said, measuring formula into bottles with practiced precision. "You can't just wing it with infants. They need structure, consistent feeding times, proper burping. Everything has to be done right." Ben sat in his armchair watching her efficiency with a mixture of gratitude and unease. His fingers drummed nervously on the worn fabric. "I was doing fine." "Sure you were." Ellen's tone was gentle but firm as she tested the temperature of a bottle against her wrist. "Now, are you going to tell me how they really ended up here?" Ben shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles whitened. "I told you what happened." Ellen shook her head and carried one of the babies to the kitchen table she'd converted into a changing station, laying out fresh diapers and wipes within easy reach. As she carefully removed the onesie, something caught her eye. Behind the baby's right ear, a small mark stood out against the soft skin. At first, she thought it was a bruise, but upon closer inspection, her heart nearly stopped. It was a tattoo, an abstract symbol she'd seen before in her darkest cases. With trembling hands, she checked the other two babies, her breath catching in her throat. The same mark, identical in size and placement, marked each child. Cold recognition washed over her as memories from a past case flooded back. A trafficking ring she'd helped investigate 2 years ago, one that still haunted her dreams. "Dad!" Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the morning quiet. "We need to call the police, right now." Ben straightened in his chair, his jaw set stubbornly. "No, I told you about the note, the phone call. These babies have trafficking tattoos." Ellen pulled out her phone and showed him similar symbols from an old case file, her hands shaking as she swiped through the horrifying images. "This isn't some random situation. These children were marked by professionals who treat them like property." "Which is exactly why we can't involve the police," Ben insisted, his voice rising with emotion. "You saw what they wrote. Their fate depends on us keeping them safe. We're all they've got right now." Ellen paced the room, running her fingers through her hair in frustration, her footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. "You're being reckless. These kids need protection from actual authorities, not just one stubborn old man with a hero complex." "And what if calling the police gets them killed?" Ben's face reddened, the vein in his temple pulsing. "What if whoever left them here has people on the inside? We don't know what we're dealing with, Ellen. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules." While Ben wasn't looking, Ellen snapped photos of the tattoos with her phone, making sure to capture every detail. She'd investigate this herself if she had to, calling in favors from her old contacts. Her father might be too scared to act, but she wouldn't sit idle while these babies remained in danger. As night fell, Ellen sat at the kitchen table, her laptop casting a blue glow across her worried face. She scrolled through archived cases and underground trafficking reports, searching for matches to the symbol, each new detail making her stomach twist with dread. In the living room, Ben kept his vigil by the window, his shotgun within reach as his eyes scanned the darkened driveway. The weight of their argument hung heavy in the air between them, along with the unspoken fear that whatever darkness had touched these children's lives might soon come knocking at their door, bringing with it a violence they weren't prepared to face. The evening sun painted long shadows across Ben's farmland as he sat on the worn wooden porch, his coffee growing cold in his hands. His eyes scanned the horizon methodically, a habit born from decades of farming but now charged with new purpose. The gentle creaking of his rocking chair matched the rhythm of Ellen's soft humming from inside, where she tended to the babies. The familiar scent of freshly turned earth drifted up from the fields, mingling with the sweet perfume of wild honeysuckle that grew along the fence line. For the first time since their arrival, the infants had started making typical baby sounds, sweet coos and occasional whimpers that somehow made them seem more real, more human. Through the screen door, Ben could hear Ellen's gentle responses to their newfound voices, her tone carrying a warmth he hadn't heard in years. "That's right, little one," she murmured. "You're finding your voice, aren't you? Such sweet sounds you're making today." Ben's attention snapped to movement in the distance. A black SUV sat partially concealed behind the tree line along the road, its tinted windows reflecting the dying sunlight like dark mirrors. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup as he studied the vehicle, trying to make out any details that might identify it. The cup trembled slightly in his weathered hands. 15 long minutes passed, each second adding to the weight in Ben's chest. The SUV finally pulled away, moving slowly down the road until it disappeared around the bend, leaving only a trail of dust in its wake. Ben released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders dropping with relief. As night settled over the farm, bringing with it a heavy darkness broken only by the yard light's dim glow and the occasional flash of fireflies, Ben sat in the living room, unable to shake his unease. Ellen had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of baby care, her soft footsteps overhead the only sound in the quiet house. The sound came just after midnight, soft footsteps crunching on gravel near the barn, distinct against the chorus of crickets and nightbirds. Ben's head snapped up, his body tensing. Without hesitation, he retrieved his shotgun from its cabinet, checking it was loaded with practiced hands that remembered every motion despite the years. The screen door opened silently as Ben stepped into the cool night air, his old boots making no sound on the familiar boards. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard like a searching finger. Near the barn's entrance, fresh, muddy footprints glistened in the artificial light, each one a stark reminder of the intrusion. Ben's breath came in measured pulls as he approached, his steps careful and deliberate despite his lingering stroke symptoms. A sudden rustling sound drew his attention to the cornfield, where tall stalks swayed in the night breeze. The beam of his flashlight caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure ducking between the rows of corn before vanishing completely into the shadows. Ben raised his shotgun instinctively, but held his fire, knowing the risk of drawing attention to their vulnerable household. When he returned to the house, Ellen was in the kitchen, a questioning look on her face, her hair mussed from sleep. She opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it, the weight of their recent arguments about the babies hanging between them like a heavy curtain. Her worried eyes followed his movements across the room. Ben secured every lock in the house, his movements methodical and thorough, testing each one twice. Finally, he settled into his armchair, watching the 3 sleeping infants in their makeshift crib, their tiny faces peaceful in the soft glow of the nightlight. Their tiny chests rose and fell peacefully, unaware of the darkness that seemed to be closing in around them. "I won't let anything happen to you," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, the promise settling deep in his bones. "Not while I'm breathing." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Ellen spooned formula into tiny mouths, her movements gentle but efficient. The morning light cast long shadows across the worn linoleum floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Ben sat at the worn oak table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without much interest. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent watching over the farmhouse, jumping at every creak and rustle in the darkness. Ellen glanced occasionally at her laptop screen while feeding the babies, her brow furrowing deeper with each click. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard between feeding times, searching for answers. The familiar clinking of Ben's fork against his plate filled the silence between them, a rhythmic sound that only heightened the tension in the room. "Dad?" Ellen said finally, her voice tight with barely contained worry. "I need to show you something." She turned her laptop around, revealing a news article with a familiar symbol. "This tattoo behind the baby's ears, I've seen it before." Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to the image. Ben set down his fork, leaning forward to examine the screen, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. The symbol matched exactly. A small, intricate design that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know its meaning, its delicate lines belying its sinister purpose. "It's from a case I worked on 3 years ago," Ellen continued, her professional demeanor cracking slightly, revealing the frightened woman beneath. "These people, they're part of an international trafficking ring. They target infants and young children, selling them to wealthy clients overseas." Her hands trembled as she pulled up more articles, each one more disturbing than the last. "They're notorious for their brutality. Anyone who crosses them—" "That's exactly why we can't go to the police," Ben interrupted, his voice firm and gravelly with conviction. "You saw the note. You know about the phone call. We both know what they promised would happen." "Dad, being stubborn about this isn't protecting anyone." Ellen's voice rose, echoing off the kitchen walls. "These people are dangerous. We need help. We're in way over our heads here." "And what happens when we call the authorities?" Ben pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a harsh sound that made them both wince. "What happens if these people have connections inside the system? Did you think about that? How deep their influence might go?" "What I think is that you're letting fear cloud your judgment." Ellen stood up, matching his intensity, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is bigger than us. We're not equipped to handle this. We're talking about professional criminals." "You always did think you knew better than everyone else," Ben muttered, shaking his head, old resentments rising to the surface. "Just like when your mother died, coming in here telling me how to grieve, how to live." "Don't you dare bring Mom into this." Ellen's eyes flashed with sudden fury and pain. "This isn't about her. This is about 3 innocent babies who need real help, not just an old man with a shotgun playing hero." The moment the words left her mouth, Ellen regretted them. Ben's face hardened, the hurt visible before he masked it with anger, his shoulders stiffening as if he'd been physically struck. "I may be old," he said quietly, each word measured and heavy with emotion, "but I know when something feels wrong. Calling the police feels wrong. These babies were left here for a reason. Someone trusted us to protect them." "Your gut feelings aren't enough anymore, Dad. We need to think rationally about this. We need a real plan." "Rational?" Ben's voice rose, his hand smacking the table. "You think it's rational to ignore direct threats? To risk these children's lives because you trust a system that's failed plenty of others? Have you forgotten the cases you've told me about?" Ellen threw up her hands in frustration, her social worker's composure completely shattered. "And you think hiding them here forever is the solution? What's your long-term plan, Dad? What happens when they figure out where the babies are, when they come here looking for them?" The babies, sensing the tension, began to whimper, their tiny faces scrunching up in distress. Ellen turned away from her father, gathering her laptop with shaking hands, her breathing uneven. "I can't watch you make this mistake," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I won't." She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Ben alone at the table. He stared into his coffee cup, now cold and forgotten, listening to Ellen's footsteps retreat upstairs, each step a sharp reminder of their divide. The baby's soft cries echoed through the old farmhouse, reminding him of everything at stake, of all the lives hanging in the balance of their decisions. Ben sat in his worn leather armchair, the blood-stained note trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor, and somewhere upstairs, he could hear Ellen's muffled footsteps as she paced back and forth. His fingers traced the cryptic message he'd read countless times before. "These are miracles, but miracles come at a cost. Keep them safe, for their fate depends on you." The words seemed to burn into his mind with each reading. Something caught his eye as he tilted the paper, tiny indentations on the back, barely visible in the sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. His heart quickened. Ben reached for the pencil on the side table, his hand shaking slightly from the lingering effects of his stroke. With careful strokes, fighting to keep his hand steady, he began shading the back of the paper. Numbers and letters emerged from the pressure marks like secret messages from the past. Pine, 42, sunset. Partial words and addresses appeared like ghosts on the page, each new revelation making his pulse race faster. Ben's breath caught when he saw one complete fragment: Blue Valley Motel. He knew that place, a rundown establishment just 20 minutes away on Route 16, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Lord above, he muttered, running a hand through his thinning gray hair, feeling the cold sweat on his scalp. The discovery felt important, maybe even dangerous. Too dangerous to ignore. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, where Ellen was probably still fuming from their argument about involving the police. She'd want to take this to the authorities right away, he knew. But something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive all these years, told him that would be a mistake. Ben pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting the movement, and tucked the note into his shirt pocket. The barn would help clear his head. It always had, ever since he was a boy. The familiar smell of hay and old wood greeted him as he stepped inside. But even here he couldn't shake his unease. His eyes kept drifting to the corner where he'd seen that shadowy figure disappear the night before, half expecting to see it again. Moving slowly but deliberately, fighting against his body's limitations, Ben walked the perimeter of his property. The cornfield swayed gently in the afternoon breeze like a living thing, and the tire tracks from that mysterious black SUV were still visible in the soft earth near the road. Everything looked normal. Peaceful even. But Ben knew better now. Nothing would ever feel quite normal again. The weight of his discovery pressed against his chest where the note lay hidden, like a secret trying to burn its way out. Part of him wanted to share it with Ellen. She was smart, trained to handle complicated situations, and maybe she'd know what to make of it all. But the memory of that threatening phone call echoed in his mind, clear as day. Forget what you saw, or you'll regret it. As the day began to fade into evening, Ben settled onto the wooden porch swing, listening to its familiar creak. The horizon stretched out before him, painted in deepening shades of purple and orange that reminded him of simpler times. From inside he could hear the soft cries of one of the babies, followed by Ellen's gentle shushing, a sound that both warmed his heart and filled it with worry. "I'll figure this out," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the evening crickets and the distant sound of cars on Route 16. The words felt like both a promise and a prayer, and he knew there would be no turning back now. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet farmhouse like ancient bells tolling a warning. Ellen padded down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the old wooden steps that had supported 3 generations of Carters. She found Ben exactly where she expected, in his favorite armchair, his silhouette outlined against the window by moonlight streaming through the thin curtains. "We need to talk," she said, setting her laptop on the coffee table with purpose, the soft thud emphasizing her determination. Ben turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the laptop screen. The past few days had etched new worry lines around his eyes, making him look older than his 63 years. His shoulders sagged with the weight of their situation. "I've been digging deeper into that symbol," Ellen continued, opening her laptop with quick, nervous movements. "And I found something disturbing." She pulled up several newspaper articles and police reports, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked through the files. "There's this couple, the Hendersons. They live in one of those massive estates just outside the city. On paper, they're philanthropists who foster children, but there's more to it." Ben leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened. "What do you mean?" "They've been investigated multiple times for suspicious activities involving their foster children. Kids disappearing without explanation, adoption papers with irregularities." Ellen's voice trembled slightly, her social worker instincts screaming danger. "And every single time the investigations just vanish. Cases dropped, witnesses changing their stories, evidence going missing. Like they never existed." "And you think they're connected to our babies?" Ben's voice was skeptical, but his eyes kept darting to the makeshift nursery they'd set up in the corner of the living room, where soft blankets and borrowed bassinets housed their precious charges. The tattoo behind their ears, It matches a symbol found in one of the Henderson cases. It was photographed before the evidence disappeared. Ellen turned her laptop to show him, the blue light casting eerie shadows across their faces. See? It's identical. Ben squinted at the screen, his mouth set in a hard line, the furrow between his brows deepening. That could be a coincidence. "Dad, please," Ellen interrupted, frustration creeping into her voice like winter frost. "I've worked these kinds of cases before. This is exactly how trafficking rings operate. They use legitimate fronts like foster homes to—" A sudden, loud banging on the front door cut through their conversation like a thunderclap. They both froze, eyes wide in the darkness, breath caught in their throats. The banging came again, more insistent this time, the sound reverberating through the old farmhouse. Ellen moved first, rushing to gather the sleeping babies from their makeshift beds, her movements quick but gentle. Ben stood slowly, his joints protesting with familiar aches, and reached for his shotgun propped against the wall. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied his shaking hands, bringing back memories of hunting trips from happier days. The pounding continued, each strike making the old door rattle in its frame like autumn leaves in a storm. Ellen clutched the babies close to her chest, their tiny forms still miraculously quiet despite the noise, their peaceful faces unaware of the danger. She backed away from the door, moving deeper into the shadows of the living room where moonlight couldn't reach. Ben checked the shotgun's chamber with practiced movements despite the tremor in his fingers. His jaw clenched with determination as he positioned himself between Ellen and the door, his stance as solid as his aging body would allow. Though fear coursed through him, the need to protect his family burned stronger. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm, never taking his eyes off the door. His grip tightened on the shotgun, ready to face whatever waited on the other side. The first hints of sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as Ben's old pickup truck rumbled down the empty highway. Ellen sat rigid in the passenger seat, her arms protectively wrapped around two of the babies while the third nestled in a makeshift carrier between them. The morning air was crisp and cool, seeping through the truck's worn weather stripping. "You should have told me about finding those addresses," Ellen said, breaking the tense silence. "We're supposed to be working together on this." Her voice carried a mix of hurt and frustration that made Ben's chest tighten. Ben's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I needed time to think it through. After everything that's happened," his voice trailed off as he focused on the road ahead, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. They pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Grove Motel, a run-down establishment with peeling paint and cracked windows. Only 3 other vehicles occupied the lot, a rusty sedan, a beaten-up van, and a motorcycle covered in dust. Dead leaves skittered across the cracked asphalt, stirred by the morning breeze. "This place looks abandoned," Ellen whispered, scanning the empty walkways. Her trained eye noted every detail, every possible escape route. "That's probably the point," Ben replied, parking near the back entrance. He killed the engine but left the key in the ignition, just in case. They carefully gathered the babies and approached room 112, where a single white candle flickered in the window. Ben knocked softly, 3 times as indicated in the note. The babies stayed remarkably quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The door opened slightly, revealing a young woman's pale face, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Come in quickly," she urged, her voice trembling. The smell of fear was almost tangible in the air. Inside, the musty room held only basic furnishings, a sagging bed, a wooden chair, and a small table. Water stains marked the ceiling, and the carpet was worn threadbare. A young man paced near the bathroom door, his hands shaking as he ran them through his disheveled hair. "I'm Maria," the woman said, wincing as she sat on the bed's edge. "This is Eric. We're the ones who left the babies." Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Ellen instinctively held the infants closer, feeling their warmth against her chest. "Why?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, spilling onto her hollow cheeks. "We were desperate. They promised us money, said it was just a delivery job." She pressed a hand to her stomach, grimacing. But when we learned what they really wanted... They're human traffickers, Eric interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. He stopped pacing long enough to lean against the wall, as if needing its support. They target vulnerable people like us, use threats to make us cooperate. But we couldn't deliver those babies to them. Why my farm? Ben asked quietly, his eyes studying both young people carefully. Maria looked up at him, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. We'd heard about you in town. People said you were honorable, that you helped others during hard times. We hoped you'd protect them. The organization, Eric added, pushing himself off the wall and moving closer. They're powerful, connected. They're already looking for the babies. And now, they're looking for you too. His words carried the weight of terrible certainty. Ellen exchanged worried glances with her father. We need to contact the authorities. No! Maria grabbed Ellen's arm with surprising strength. They have people everywhere, police, government. You can't trust anyone. Her fingers dug into Ellen's sleeve, desperate and pleading. Suddenly, bright lights flooded through the thin curtains, casting harsh shadows across the worn carpet. The rumble of multiple engines filled the air, followed by the sound of car doors slamming shut with ominous finality. They found us, Eric whispered, moving to peek through the curtains. His face went ashen. 3 SUVs, armed men. His hands trembled as he let the curtain fall back into place. Heavy footsteps crunched on gravel, growing closer to their room. The sound echoed like a countdown to disaster. Ellen clutched the babies tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. We need to get out of here. Now. The infant stirred in her arms, sensing her fear. The motel room felt like a trap closing in around them. Heavy footsteps and angry voices echoed from the parking lot as Maria clutched her stomach, tears streaming down her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Eric paced frantically, his shoes wearing a path in the thin carpet, running his hands through his disheveled hair. Please, Maria whispered, her voice breaking. You have to save them. These men, they'll do horrible things to those babies. I've seen what they're capable of. Ellen's eyes darted around the cramped room, taking in the peeling wallpaper and stained ceiling, until they landed on a small window near the bathroom. There, she pointed, hope flickering in her voice. We can fit through that. Ben nodded, already moving toward it with determined steps. His hands shook slightly as he worked the rusty latch, but years of farm work had kept him strong despite his recent stroke. The window creaked open with a grinding protest, revealing a narrow alley behind the motel lined with overflowing dumpsters. What about you? Ellen asked Maria and Eric, cradling one of the babies close to her chest, feeling its tiny heart beating against her. Maria straightened her shoulders, wiping tears away with trembling fingers. We'll keep them busy. Give you time to get away. We know what we're doing. They're breaking down doors, Eric hissed, peeking through the threadbare curtains. Looking room by room, 3 men, maybe more. Ben carefully passed the first baby through the window to Ellen, who had already climbed out into the cool night air. The second baby followed, then the third, each making small whimpering sounds. Ben's joints protested as he squeezed through the opening, but adrenaline pushed him forward, his breath coming in short gasps. Thank you, Ellen whispered to Maria and Eric, her voice thick with emotion. We'll find a way to help you, I promise. Maria managed a weak smile, though fear danced in her eyes. Just keep them safe. That's all that matters now. Get them far away from here. Suddenly, heavy fists pounded on their door, making them all jump. Open up! We know you're in there! Maria took a deep breath and screamed, a piercing sound that echoed through the whole motel, making the windows rattle. Eric grabbed a lamp, ripping its cord from the wall, ready to fight. Go! He mouthed to Ben and Ellen, his jaw set with determination. Ben and Ellen hurried down the alley, the babies remarkably quiet in their arms as if sensing the danger. Behind them, they heard the door splinter open with a terrible crack, followed by sounds of struggle and Maria's continued screams. Eric's angry shouts joined the chaos, and something crashed against a wall with a sickening thud. They reached the truck just as someone yelled, "They're gone! Check outside!" The words carried clearly through the still night air. Ben's hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them in his haste. Ellen climbed in, carefully arranging the babies across her lap, wrapping them tighter in their blankets. The engine roared to life with a thunderous growl just as the first thugs rounded the corner of the building, their heavy boots pounding on the pavement. Gunshots cracked through the air like thunder as Ben floored the accelerator. The truck's tires spun in the gravel before catching hold, throwing stones in all directions. They shot forward, more bullets pinging off the truck's metal body with hollow metallic sounds. Ellen ducked low, shielding the babies with her body, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her voice shook as she watched the motel shrink in the side mirror, thinking of the young couple they'd left behind. "We'll come back for them." She blinked back tears, knowing that promise might be impossible to keep. The hunting cabin creaked under the morning breeze, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating dancing particles in the air. Ben slumped into an old armchair, his muscles aching from the night's escape. His breathing was heavy, and his hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline. The familiar scent of pine and old leather brought back memories of happier times spent here with Ellen when she was young. Ellen moved efficiently around the small space, laying the babies on a clean blanket she'd spread across the worn couch. Her social worker instincts kicked in as she checked each infant for signs of distress, her gentle hands checking temperatures and reflexes. "They seem okay," she said softly, "just hungry and a bit tired from all the excitement." "There's some canned milk in the pantry," Ben muttered, pointing to a narrow door with peeling brown paint. "Used to keep supplies here during hunting season. Should still be good. I restocked last fall." While Ellen prepared bottles, warming them carefully in a pot of water on the old propane stove, Ben's eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning the tree line. The cabin sat in a clearing, giving them a good view of anyone approaching. But the isolation that once brought him peace now felt oppressive. Every rustling branch made him tense. "We need a plan," Ellen said, cradling one of the babies while feeding them. The infant's tiny hands wrapped around her finger as they drank hungrily. "We can't keep running forever." As she sorted through the baby's belongings, her hand brushed against something hard within one of the white blankets. Frowning, she pulled out a sleek smartphone, carefully wrapped in protective padding. The device looked new and expensive, completely out of place among the worn baby items. "Dad, look at this," Ellen called, her voice tight with excitement. Her hand shook slightly as she held the phone. Ben pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting the movement, and moved closer as Ellen powered on the device. The screen flickered to life, revealing dozens of encrypted files. Ellen's fingers flew across the screen, her experience with case documentation guiding her through the data. The blue light from the screen cast shadows across her determined face. "These are transaction records," she gasped. "Names, dates, amounts. Dad, this is everything. Evidence of the whole operation. There are spreadsheets, photos, contact lists. It's all here." Ben leaned in, his weathered face creasing with concern as he studied the screen over her shoulder. "That makes it more dangerous. These people, they'll do anything to keep this quiet. We've already seen what they're capable of." "But this could save more children," Ellen argued, her voice rising with passion. "We could expose everything, bring down the whole network. Think of how many kids we could help." "And paint an even bigger target on our backs?" Ben shook his head, running his fingers through his gray hair. "We need to be smart about this. One wrong move could get us all killed." Ellen stood up, pacing the small room. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. "I know people, Dad. Trusted contacts from my work. They could help us use this information safely. People who know how to handle sensitive cases." "The last time we trusted someone," Ben's voice trailed off, thinking of Maria and Eric at the motel. The memory of their betrayal still stung fresh. "That was different," Ellen insisted, though her voice softened as she saw the pain in her father's eyes. "These would be professionals, people who handle cases like this. They've helped me before with trafficking victims." Ben ran a hand over his face, considering. The babies cooed softly from their makeshift bed, reminding them both of what was at stake. One of them smiled, showing pink gums, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Okay, he finally agreed, his voice rough with emotion. But we're careful about who we contact. We do this right. Ellen nodded, already scrolling through her mental list of reliable contacts, people she'd worked with over years of cases. The phone buzzed suddenly in her hand, making her jump. A text message appeared on the screen from an unknown number. Her face went pale as she read the words, her hands beginning to shake. "We know where you are. Bring the babies or your father dies." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, turning the cozy cabin into something menacing. Ellen's hands trembled violently as she held up her phone, showing Ben the threatening message. The dim cabin light cast long, menacing shadows across his weathered face as he read it, his jaw tightening with each word. Deep lines of worry etched themselves around his eyes as he processed the implications. "They found us already," Ellen whispered, glancing anxiously at the sleeping babies bundled in their makeshift beds. Her voice caught in her throat. "We need help, Dad." Ben nodded slowly, his decades of farmer's instincts screaming that they were running out of time. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, buying moments to consider their options. "What's your plan?" "There's someone I trust. Sarah Daniels. She's an investigative journalist I worked with on a trafficking case a few years back. She's been trying to expose these rings for years. She knows how to handle sensitive situations like this." Ellen dialed Sarah's number with shaking fingers, pacing the creaky floorboards while she waited. When Sarah answered, her voice was sharp and professional. "Sarah, it's Ellen Carter. I need your help with something big." "Yes, trafficking related. We have evidence, lots of it. Can you meet us?" The hope in her voice was painfully clear. While Ellen arranged the meeting, Ben grabbed his old metal toolbox and started working on the cabin's defenses. He methodically nailed boards across the windows, leaving small strategic gaps for observation. His hands, though weakened from his stroke, moved with determined purpose as he set up simple alarm systems, tin cans on strings near potential entry points, positioning them carefully to catch any intruder. "Sarah's meeting us tomorrow in the city," Ellen reported, throwing her weight behind a heavy oak dresser as she helped Ben move it against one of the doors. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the effort. "She says she has contacts who can protect us while we expose everything." Ben grunted acknowledgement, focusing on his work with single-minded intensity. The babies needed changing, and Ellen tended to them with practiced efficiency, though her eyes kept darting nervously to the windows, checking and rechecking the deepening shadows outside. Late afternoon light filtered through the barricaded windows when Ellen noticed something that made her stomach drop like a stone. Fresh footprints marked the mud near the tree line, too deliberate and patterned to be from wildlife. Broken branches and disturbed undergrowth suggested someone had been watching them, perhaps for hours. "Dad," she called softly, pointing out the signs with a trembling finger. Ben's face grew grim as he examined the evidence of surveillance, his weathered hands clenching into fists at his sides. "We'll leave for the city before dawn," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "It's our best chance." Ellen nodded, double-checking the encrypted files on the hidden phone while Ben finished fortifying their temporary shelter, adding extra reinforcements to the weakest points. The babies remained unusually quiet in their corner, as if sensing the thick tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. As darkness crept in, Ellen positioned herself by the window, scanning the tree line with increasing anxiety. Her heart nearly stopped when she caught movement, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, moving with deliberate purpose through the gathering gloom. "Ben," she whispered urgently, her voice barely above a breath. "They're here." The night pressed against the cabin windows like a heavy blanket, its darkness seeming almost alive with menace. Ellen's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat as she cradled one of the babies, while Ben gripped his shotgun with steady hands that betrayed years of hunting experience. The old floorboards creaked and groaned beneath their feet as they moved carefully through the darkness, each step measured and deliberate. A sudden crash shattered the silence like a thunderclap. The front door shuddered violently in its frame as someone tried to force it open, the wood straining against the metal hinges. Ben's muscles tensed like coiled springs, and Ellen clutched the baby tighter against her chest, feeling its tiny heartbeat. "Get those babies hidden," Ben whispered urgently, his voice rough with worry. Rough voices shouted from outside, their tone filled with barely contained violence. "Come out now! Hand over the children and nobody gets hurt!" The words echoed through the night air. The sound of gunfire crackled through the air, warning shots that made Ellen jump and her skin crawl. She quickly gathered all 3 babies, who remained strangely quiet despite the chaos, their eyes wide and alert. Her hands trembled like autumn leaves as she lifted the loose floorboard, revealing the small cellar beneath. The space was tight but dry, carefully lined with old blankets from their earlier preparations, creating a makeshift nest. "You're safe, little ones," Ellen whispered, her voice catching as she carefully lowered them into the space. The babies stared up at her with those unnaturally calm eyes, seeming to understand far more than they should. More crashes echoed through the cabin as the attackers began breaking through the barricaded windows with renewed fury. Glass shattered like rain, and wood splintered with sickening cracks. Ben took position near the front window, his weathered face set with determination as his shotgun trained on the shadows moving outside. The blast of Ben's shotgun thundered through the cabin, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A man's scream pierced the night like a knife, followed by cursing and scrambling footsteps as the attackers temporarily fell back into the darkness. Ellen rushed to the kitchen, her feet barely touching the floor as she grabbed their emergency bag filled with supplies. The smell of smoke suddenly filled her nostrils, acrid and threatening. Through the window, she spotted flames licking up the side of the cabin, the orange glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. "They're trying to smoke us out," she called to Ben, fear making her voice crack. Ben moved quickly despite his age and recent stroke, grabbing the fire extinguisher they'd prepared for just such an emergency. He aimed through a broken window, the white spray catching 2 of the men off guard and sending them stumbling backward. In the confusion, a bullet whizzed through the air and grazed Ben's arm, tearing his sleeve and drawing blood that gleamed black in the darkness. "Dad!" Ellen cried out in horror, but Ben waved her off with his characteristic stubbornness. "It's just a scratch," he growled, continuing to fight back with renewed determination. The battle continued through the long night, with Ben using every trick he'd learned from decades of hunting to keep the attackers at bay. He positioned himself strategically around the cabin, firing from different windows, making it seem like there were more defenders inside than just him. His experience showed in every calculated move. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in pale purple and gold, the attackers finally retreated into the shadows of the forest. Their curses and threats faded into the distance like a bad dream, leaving behind the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder that hung heavy in the air. Ben slumped into his old wooden chair, the adrenaline finally wearing off as he pressed a cloth against his wounded arm. Ellen emerged from checking on the babies in the cellar, her face streaked with soot and worry, her eyes red from the smoke. "They're safe," she said softly, looking at her father's injury with concern in her eyes. "But you're right, this isn't over." The weight of those words hung between them like a physical presence in the room. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's weathered porch as Ellen ended her call with Sarah. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked her phone away, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "She'll meet us at an old warehouse in the city," Ellen said, turning to Ben, who was carefully wrapping one of the babies in a warm blanket. "Says it's secure and private. No cameras, no witnesses." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Ben's face showed the strain of the previous night's attack. A purple bruise bloomed on his temple like a dark flower, and his movements were stiff from the struggle. Still, his hands remained gentle as he secured the baby, humming softly to keep the little one calm. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice gravelly from exhaustion. His eyes met hers, filled with concern and something deeper, a father's protective instinct that had awakened in him. Ellen nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "We don't have much choice. These files could bring down their whole operation. Names, dates, locations, everything we need to stop them." They loaded the babies into Ben's old truck, making sure they were safely secured in makeshift car seats fashioned from blankets and pillows. The cabin, their temporary refuge, now stood battered and broken behind them. Bullet holes peppered the walls like angry stars, and broken glass glittered on the ground like deadly diamonds. The drive into the city was tense. Every passing car made them flinch, and Ellen constantly checked the rearview mirror, her neck aching from the constant motion. The babies, surprisingly, remained calm throughout the journey, occasionally cooing softly as if trying to comfort their protectors. The warehouse loomed before them, its brick walls stained with age and neglect. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and graffiti marked the lower walls like primitive cave paintings. Sarah stood waiting by a rusty side door, her professional appearance somehow out of place in the industrial setting, her cream-colored blazer a stark contrast to the grime around her. "Thank goodness you made it," Sarah said, ushering them inside. Her smile seemed genuine as she cooed at the babies, reaching out to touch their tiny hands. "Let me see what you found." Ellen handed over the phone, watching anxiously as Sarah scrolled through the files. The warehouse felt cavernous around them, their footsteps echoing off concrete floors and metal walls. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light filtering through high, grimy windows. "This is exactly what we need," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. "With this evidence—" The sudden screech of tires outside cut her off. Heavy boots thundered against pavement, and voices shouted commands like angry hornets. Sarah's warm demeanor vanished like smoke. Her smile twisted into something cold and calculating as she stepped back, still clutching the phone. Her transformation was so complete it was as if a mask had been ripped away. "I'm sorry," she said, though her voice held no remorse. "But did you really think you could take down an organization this powerful? You're just farmers playing at being heroes." Ellen's heart dropped as armed men burst through the doors, their weapons gleaming dully in the dim light. Ben immediately stepped in front of her and the babies, his injured body tensing for another fight, his farmer's hands curling into determined fists. "You were working with them all along," Ellen whispered, the betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. Her throat tightened with rage and disappointment. "Business is business," Sarah shrugged, smoothing her perfect blazer. "Now hand over the babies, and maybe we'll let you walk away, though I doubt my associates are feeling particularly generous after last night." Ben's eyes darted to a small side exit behind some old crates. He squeezed Ellen's arm gently, a signal. His touch carried years of unspoken words. "Trust me. Follow my lead. We'll protect them together." In one fluid motion, Ellen scooped up the babies while Ben knocked over a stack of metal drums, creating a momentary barrier between them and their attackers. The crash was deafening in the enclosed space. They ran for the exit as shots rang out behind them, bullets pinging off metal and concrete. They burst into the morning sunlight, sprinting for the truck. Ellen's lungs burned as she clutched the babies close, their tiny bodies warm against her chest. Ben threw himself into the driver's seat, gunning the engine before Ellen's door was fully closed. The truck roared to life like an angry beast. As they sped away, Ellen fought back tears of rage and disappointment. The evidence was gone, and they were back to square one. The babies whimpered softly, picking up on her distress. "I'm so stupid," she choked out. "I led us right into their trap. I should have known better, should have seen through her act." Ben took one hand off the wheel and squeezed her shoulder. His touch was warm and steady, despite everything. "We'll find another way. We always do." Ben's hands trembled as he read the note for the 10th time. The morning sunlight filtered through the barn's weathered boards, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. The 3 babies slept peacefully in their makeshift beds of blankets, unaware of the chaos surrounding them. "Ellen," he whispered, his voice catching. The familiar ache in his leg from his stroke seemed more pronounced as he paced the barn's length. Memories of his wife's death flooded back, that same helpless feeling, that same crushing weight in his chest. The barn smelled of old hay and motor oil. Jim had always been meticulous about maintaining his farm equipment, and various tools hung neatly on the walls. Ben ran his fingers along a wrench, remembering simpler times when his biggest worry was fixing a broken tractor. One of the babies stirred, making soft cooing sounds. Ben shuffled over, his movements careful but determined. The smallest one, whom Ellen had taken to calling Angel, opened her eyes and stared up at him. Those eyes seemed to hold wisdom beyond their infant years. I should have protected her better, Ben muttered, gently adjusting Angel's blanket. Should have known they'd try something like this. He pulled out his old flip phone, staring at it. The meeting location was clear. An abandoned factory on the edge of town, tonight at midnight. The warning about no police made his stomach churn. Ben checked his watch, 9:30 a.m. He had less than 15 hours to figure out how to save his daughter without sacrificing these innocent babies. The thought of handing them over to those monsters made him physically ill. Moving to the barn door, Ben peered out at the surrounding fields. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the empty countryside. Jim's property was isolated, perfect for hiding, but also perfect for those who might want to cause harm. He returned to the babies, watching them sleep. The second one, slightly bigger than Angel, clutched at his blanket with tiny fists. The third one lay perfectly still, breathing softly. Ben remembered Ellen's words about the tattoos behind their ears, marking them as property to be sold. "Your mama and daddy tried to save you," he said softly, thinking of Maria and Eric at the motel. "Now Ellen's trying too. Can't let that all be for nothing." Ben lowered himself onto a hay bale, his joints protesting. The note crumpled in his grip as his mind raced through possibilities. He couldn't call the police. They'd proven corrupt before, and Ellen's life hung in the balance. He couldn't give up the babies, that wasn't even a consideration. "Think, old man," he urged himself. "Think like you used to before everything went wrong." His eyes fell on Jim's tool wall again, and something stirred in his memory. Jim had always been good with electronics, had even shown Ben some tricks during their younger days. In the corner of the barn sat Jim's old laptop, used for tracking inventory and weather patterns. Ben's hands shook less as he stood up. He might not be able to fight like a young man anymore, but he had something these criminals didn't expect. A lifetime of learning how to work around problems, how to fix things that seemed broken beyond repair. "Hold on, Ellen," he whispered, moving toward the laptop. "Your old dad's got one last trick up his sleeve." Ben's weathered hands gripped the threatening note, his knuckles white with tension. The barn's musty air hung heavy around him as morning light streamed through the cracks between wooden planks. The three babies slept peacefully nearby, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "I can't do it," he muttered, shaking his head. "Can't give you up. Can't lose Ellen either." His stroke-weakened leg trembled as he paced the barn's worn floorboards. The original note that came with the babies caught his eye where it lay on a hay bale. He picked it up, reading the words again. "These are miracles, but miracles come at a cost." Something clicked in his mind. These babies weren't just victims, they were evidence. Living proof of the trafficking ring's crimes. Ben pulled out his old flip phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He remembered a name from Ellen's research, Daniel Hayes, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. Unlike Sarah, Hayes had a reputation for integrity and had been working to bring down trafficking networks for years. With trembling fingers, Ben dialed the number he'd seen in Ellen's notes. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. "Daniel Hayes speaking." "Mr. Hayes," Ben's voice cracked. "My name is Ben Carter. My daughter Ellen, she's been taken. We have evidence about the trafficking ring you've been investigating." There was a long pause before Hayes responded, his tone cautious but interested. "Tell me everything." Ben explained the situation. The babies, the encrypted files, Sarah's betrayal, and Ellen's kidnapping. Hayes listened intently, asking sharp questions that showed his expertise. "I can help," Hayes said finally. "We can use the files as bait, set up a sting operation. I have contacts in law enforcement who've been building a case against this organization for months." Relief flooded through Ben's body. What do we need to do? As Hayes outlined the plan, Ben began gathering supplies from around the barn. He stacked hay bales to create defensive positions and secured the large sliding doors with heavy chains. Between preparations, he tended to the babies, their innocent faces strengthening his resolve. "These monsters won't win," he whispered to them as he checked their blankets. "Not this time." Working methodically despite his limitations, Ben transformed the barn into a temporary fortress. He positioned his shotgun within easy reach and set up battery-powered lanterns for when darkness fell. Hayes promised to arrive with his team before midnight. As the sun began to set, Ben sat beside the sleeping babies. His body ached from the day's work, but his mind was clear. He wouldn't fail these children, and he wouldn't fail Ellen. The thought of his daughter in the trafficker's hands made his heart clench, but he pushed down his fear. She was strong. She'd hold on until they could reach her. In the growing darkness, Ben kept his vigil. His shotgun rested across his lap as he watched shadows lengthen across the barn floor. "Hold on, Ellen," he whispered. "I'm coming for you." The first rays of dawn painted the sky in muted purples and grays as Ben Carter stood before the weathered barn. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the baby carrier, making sure the 3 infants were secure. Despite the cool morning air, sweat beaded on his forehead. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical burden. 20 yards away, his old pickup truck sat hidden behind a cluster of trees. Further back, Daniel Hayes and a team of law enforcement officers maintained their positions, their binoculars trained on the scene. Ben could feel their watchful presence, though he couldn't see them. Taking a deep breath, he approached the barn's entrance. The rusty hinges creaked as he pulled the heavy door open, sending a shiver down his spine. The interior was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. 4 men stood waiting, their weapons visible in shoulder holsters. In the center of the room, Ellen sat bound to a wooden chair, her head bowed. When she heard Ben's footsteps, she looked up, her eyes wide with fear and concern. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Shut up," one of the men snapped, stepping forward. He was tall and lean, with cold eyes that reminded Ben of a snake. "You brought what we asked for?" Ben nodded slowly, carefully setting down the carrier. "They're here. But I need to know Ellen will be safe." "You're not in a position to make demands," the man snarled, moving closer to Ellen and pressing a gun against her temple. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. He needed to buy more time, needed to ensure Daniel and the officers were ready. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just want to make sure you'll keep your word. These babies, they're innocent in all this." "The babies aren't your concern anymore," another man growled, stepping forward to grab the carrier. Ben coughed sharply, the signal. Instantly, the barn erupted into chaos. The doors burst open as officers stormed in from multiple directions, their weapons drawn. "FBI, drop your weapons!" Daniel's voice boomed through the confusion. The traffickers whirled around, caught off guard. 2 immediately dropped their guns, while another tried to make a break for it. The leader pressed his gun harder against Ellen's head, using her as a shield. Gunfire exploded through the barn. The runner went down with a shot to the leg. Officers tackled the others, forcing them to the ground. The leader's hand wavered for just a moment, but it was enough. An officer's precise shot knocked the weapon from his grip, and he was quickly subdued. Ben rushed to Ellen, his fingers fumbling with the ropes that bound her. When she was free, she fell into his arms, sobbing, "Dad, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." He held her tight, his own tears falling freely. "You're safe now. You're safe." The babies miraculously remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, protected in their carrier as officers secured the scene and led the traffickers away in handcuffs. Sunlight streamed through the precinct windows as Ben and Ellen sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their voices hoarse from hours of giving statements. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. In a nearby room, social workers tended to the 3 babies, their gentle coos occasionally drifting through the hallway. "Another trafficking location discovered in the warehouse district," an officer announced, hurrying past with a stack of papers. The news coverage played quietly on a mounted TV, showing footage of police cars surrounding various buildings across the city. The headline scrolled beneath, "Major Child Trafficking Ring Exposed. High-profile arrests underway." Ellen watched the screen, her shoulders finally relaxing after days of tension. She turned to Ben, who sat quietly beside her, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm sorry I doubted you. What you did back there." Her voice caught, That was incredibly brave. Ben shifted in his chair, unused to such praise from his daughter. Couldn't have done it without you, Ellen. Your expertise, your determination. You're just like your mother that way. His voice grew thick with emotion. Daniel Hayes approached them, his press badge swinging from his neck. His tie was loosened, and dark circles ringed his eyes, but he smiled warmly. Ben, Ellen, I can't thank you enough for trusting me with this story. He pulled up a chair beside them. My first article goes live tomorrow morning. We're naming names, exposing connections. This organization won't recover from this. What about Maria and Eric? Ellen asked, thinking of the young couple from the motel. They're safe, Daniel assured her. They've agreed to testify in exchange for protection. Their testimony will be crucial in bringing down some of the bigger players. A detective emerged from an interview room, nodding at them. We've got everything we need for now. You're free to go home. She smiled warmly. The babies are being checked by a pediatrician, but they're perfectly healthy. You did good, both of you. Ben stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting. Ellen steadied him with a gentle hand on his arm. Together, they walked to collect the babies, who greeted them with bright eyes and tiny grasping hands. As they loaded the infants into Ben's truck, the weight of the past few days began to lift. Ellen climbed into the passenger seat while Ben settled behind the wheel. The engine rumbled to life, and they pulled away from the station, leaving behind the bustle of reporters and police cars. Ellen reached over and squeezed her father's hand. We did it, she said simply, tears of relief glistening in her eyes. Ben squeezed back, his heart full as they drove toward home and whatever new challenges awaited them as a family. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ben's cornfield as he and Ellen pulled up to the farmhouse. The familiar crunch of gravel under the truck's tires felt different now, more like coming home than ever before. In the back seat, the three babies dozed peacefully in their car seats, tiny hands occasionally twitching in their sleep. Never thought I'd be so happy to see this old place, Ellen said softly, gathering bags from the trunk while Ben carefully lifted the first baby carrier. Inside, the farmhouse felt transformed. Sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. The musty silence that had dominated the house for years was replaced by the gentle sounds of infant breathing and Ellen's purposeful footsteps as she moved through the rooms. We'll put the nursery here, Ellen declared, stepping into the spare room that had sat unused since she'd left for college. She began unpacking supplies they'd bought on the way home: diapers, formula, tiny clothes, and soft pastels. Her movements were quick and determined, as if making up for lost time. Ben watched from the doorway, one of the babies cradled against his chest. The weight felt right somehow, like his arms had been waiting all these years to hold something so precious. His mind wandered back to the warehouse confrontation, remembering the surge of protective strength that had coursed through him despite his limitations. The stroke had taken so much, but these babies had given him something invaluable in return, a reason to push beyond his constraints. I spoke with Sandra at Child Services, Ellen said, arranging stuffed animals in a corner. She knows a wonderful foster family. They've worked with trafficking survivors before. She paused, smoothing a blanket. They'll give these little ones the care they need while the investigation continues. Ben nodded, though his heart twinged. They deserve a real family, he agreed quietly. People who can keep them safe. Ellen stopped her organizing and looked at her father. You did keep them safe, Dad. When it mattered most, you were there for them. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Just like you're here for me now. Together, they spent the afternoon settling into a gentle routine. Ellen demonstrated proper bottle-feeding techniques while Ben mastered the art of one-handed diaper changes. The babies seemed to respond to the calm atmosphere, their earlier unnatural quietness giving way to more typical infant behaviors: gurgles, coos, and the occasional cry. As evening approached, Ben eased himself into his favorite porch chair, a cup of tea steaming beside him. Through the screen door, he could hear Ellen softly singing a lullaby, the same one her mother used to sing. The stars began appearing overhead, bright pinpricks in the darkening sky. The familiar chorus of crickets and distant owls created a peaceful symphony. Inside, the babies slept soundly in their temporary nursery, safe and secure. Ben felt the tension of the past weeks finally begin to ease from his shoulders. The farm that had felt like a prison after his stroke now felt like exactly where he was meant to be. The phone's shrill ring pierced the early morning quiet, making Ben startle in his armchair where he dozed off watching the babies. Ellen hurried to answer it, her voice hushed to avoid waking the little ones. "Yes, this is Ellen Carter," she said. Then her eyes widened. "I see. Yes. I understand it's a big story." Ben watched his daughter's expression shift as she listened. The babies stirred slightly in their makeshift crib, and he gently rocked it with his foot to soothe them. "The story's everywhere," Ellen announced after hanging up. "Major networks, newspapers, online media, they're all covering the trafficking ring takedown, and they want to talk to us." As if on cue, another call came through, then another. By mid-morning, cars began appearing on their quiet country road. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters clutching notebooks, photographers with long lenses. "I can't believe this," Ellen muttered, peeking through the curtains. She'd already turned down 3 interview requests in the past hour. They're like vultures. Ben remained in his chair, keeping watch over the babies while Ellen handled the growing circus outside. He had no interest in cameras or microphones. His focus remained on the 3 tiny lives that had changed everything. "Mr. Carter," a voice called from outside. "Just a few questions about your heroic actions." Ellen's patience wore thin as she fielded calls and deflected questions. "We can't comment on an ongoing investigation," she repeated for what felt like the 100th time. The breaking point came when Ben spotted movement by the side window, a reporter with a camera snapping photos through the glass. The babies were clearly visible in their crib, and the thought of their pictures being splashed across the news made Ben's blood run cold. "That's it," Ellen said firmly, already dialing the sheriff's number. "Hello? Yes, we need help with a trespassing situation." Sheriff Miller arrived within minutes, his presence sending the more cautious reporters scurrying back to their vehicles. He confronted the photographer, who tried to claim he was just doing his job. "Your job doesn't include trespassing on private property or photographing minors without consent," the sheriff stated firmly, confiscating the camera's memory card. "Now, I suggest you and your colleagues clear out before I start writing citations." As the crowd of reporters gradually dispersed, Ellen sat heavily on the couch. "They'll lose interest eventually," she assured Ben, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Once the next big story comes along." Ben nodded silently, his weathered hands still gently rocking the baby's crib. His eyes kept drifting to the windows, watching for any other uninvited guests who might try to intrude on their peace. The kitchen light cast a warm glow as Ben and Ellen sat at the worn wooden table, sharing a simple dinner of meatloaf and potatoes. The day's chaos of persistent reporters and phone calls had finally subsided, leaving them in a comfortable silence broken only by the gentle clink of silverware against plates. "At least the babies are sleeping well," Ben said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Ellen nodded, absently scrolling through her phone. Her fork clattered against her plate as she opened a new email. The subject line made her blood run cold. "You think it's over?" And her hands trembled as she read the message, the threatening words burning into her mind. "We're always watching. Your involvement has consequences." Below the text were several grainy photos, one showing her checking the mailbox that morning, another of Ben tending to the garden. The timestamps were from earlier that day. She glanced at her father, who was focused on his meal, his weathered face lined with fatigue. The weight of this new threat pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to add to his burdens. With quick movements, she deleted the email and set her phone face down on the table. Rising from her chair, Ellen methodically moved through the house, checking each window lock and testing every door. The familiar routine helped calm her racing thoughts, though her hand still shook slightly. Meanwhile, Ben stepped outside to close up the barn for the night. His keen eyes noticed details that seemed off. Patches of grass near the barn entrance were flattened in an unnatural way, as if someone had been standing there watching. A cigarette butt lay half buried in the dirt. its filter still white, recently discarded. His jaw tightened, but he kept his discovery to himself, not wanting to worry Ellen after everything they'd been through. Back inside, Ellen peered through the curtains at the darkening yard. The shadows seemed longer, more menacing than usual. She jumped slightly when Ben's hand touched her shoulder. "Going to sit on the porch for a bit," he said, his shotgun already in hand. "Keep an eye on things." Ellen watched as he settled into his usual chair, his posture alert despite his casual demeanor. After checking on the sleeping babies one more time, she joined him outside. Neither spoke as they stared into the gathering darkness, both carrying their private fears in silence. The night air grew cooler and Ellen wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes scanning the tree line. She could feel her father's quiet strength beside her, and for a moment, their shared vigilance felt like enough to keep the shadows at bay. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse windows as Ellen hung up the phone, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "That was Detective Morrison," she said, turning to Ben, who sat in his usual spot by the window. "Maria and Eric are in protective custody. They're going to testify against the organization." Ben's weathered hands tightened around his coffee mug. "Good," he muttered, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "I want to visit them," Ellen said firmly. "They need support right now, and they might have more information that could help the investigation." Ben's jaw clenched. "After what they did, they were victims too, Dad." Ellen's voice softened. "Will you come with me?" After a long pause, Ben nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm not promising to be friendly." At the safe house, a modest suburban home with drawn curtains and security cameras, Maria sat hunched on a worn sofa. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked smaller somehow, more fragile than before. Eric stood protectively beside her, his hand on her shoulder. When Maria saw Ellen, she burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "We never wanted to hurt those babies. We didn't know what else to do." Ben shifted uncomfortably, watching as Ellen sat beside the crying woman. "We were brought here from Mexico," Maria continued, wiping her eyes. "They promised us jobs, but instead—" Her voice cracked. "They took our papers, threatened our families, made us work for them." Eric squeezed her shoulder. "They said they'd kill her if I didn't cooperate. But when we saw those babies—" He shook his head, unable to continue. Ben's stern expression began to soften as he listened to their story. The anger he'd been holding on to started to dissolve, replaced by an uncomfortable understanding. Ellen spoke up, her social worker instincts taking over. "You were victims of trafficking yourselves. That needs to be considered in your case. I'll speak to the prosecutor about reduced sentences." Ben cleared his throat. "You could have gone to the police." "We tried once," Eric said quietly. "The officer was on their payroll. After that—" He gestured to a faded scar on his forearm. The room fell silent except for Maria's quiet sniffles. Ellen reached out and took her hand, while Ben stood by the window, processing everything he'd heard. As they prepared to leave, Ben paused in the doorway. Looking back at Maria and Eric, he spoke gruffly but without anger. "I still don't trust them completely, but I can't hate them either. Maybe they deserve a chance." The safe house looked less intimidating in the warm afternoon light as Ben and Ellen pulled into the driveway. This time, Ben's shoulders weren't as tense, though his expression remained guarded. "Thank you for coming back," Ellen said softly, touching his arm. "I know this isn't easy." Inside, Maria and Eric sat at a small kitchen table, 2 cups of untouched coffee before them. Maria's face brightened slightly when she saw Ellen, and even Ben noticed she seemed calmer than during their first visit. "We've been talking to the investigators," Maria began, her voice steadier now, "telling them everything we know about the organization." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. "They target people like us. Immigrants, runaways, anyone desperate enough to believe their lies." Ben settled into a chair, his weathered hands folded on the table. "How did they get you involved with the babies?" Eric leaned forward, his voice low. "They start small, make you feel like family. Then they ask for favors, each one bigger than the last. Before you know it, you're in too deep." They showed us pictures of our families back home, Maria added, tears welling in her eyes. Said they'd hurt them if we didn't cooperate, but when we saw those babies, she shook her head. Something broke inside us. We couldn't do it anymore. Ben's expression softened as he listened. Why my farm? We'd been driving around for hours looking for somewhere safe, Eric explained. Then we saw your farm. It looked peaceful, like a place where good people lived. He met Ben's eyes. You're a hero, Mr. Carter. What you did, standing up to them, protecting those babies, it gave us hope that maybe there are still good people in the world. Ellen watched as her father's stern facade crumbled slightly. She could see him wrestling with his emotions, trying to reconcile his anger with the young, broken people before him. We know we can never make up for what we did, Maria said softly. But maybe by helping the investigation, we can stop it from happening to someone else. The drive home was quiet, the setting sun painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Ben stared straight ahead, processing everything he'd heard. Finally, he turned to Ellen and said quietly, They were just kids themselves. Maybe they were just looking for someone to believe in them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farmyard. As Ellen hung up the phone, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. She found Ben in the kitchen, stirring his coffee absently. That was child services, she said gently. They've found a foster family. They're coming today. Ben's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. Already? They're good people, Dad. The agency vetted them thoroughly. They've fostered before. Around 2 o'clock, a modest SUV pulled into the driveway. A couple emerged, warm smiles and kind eyes. Sarah and Michael Anderson introduced themselves with gentle handshakes and genuine gratitude. What you did for these babies, Sarah said, her eyes welling up. We can't thank you enough. Ben nodded stiffly, leading them inside where the babies lay in their makeshift nursery. The room, once just a spare space, now held precious memories of midnight feedings and soft lullabies. Could I have a moment? Ben asked, his voice rough. The others stepped out, leaving Ben alone with the babies. He lowered himself into the rocking chair, gathering them close one last time. Their familiar weight settled against his chest, tiny hands clutching at his shirt. You brought something back to life in me, he whispered, rocking slowly. I'll never forget you little ones. Never. Ellen appeared in the doorway, her eyes soft with understanding. They're going to send pictures, Dad. Regular updates. The Andersons want us to stay connected. Ben nodded, unable to speak. With gentle care, he placed each baby in Sarah's waiting arms. The babies cooed and giggled, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Michael carefully secured them in their car seats while Sarah shared their contact information with Ellen. We'll take good care of them, Sarah promised, squeezing Ben's hand. They'll know about the brave man who saved them. Ben watched from the porch as the SUV pulled away, the babies' faces visible through the back window. His cheeks were wet with tears, but a small smile played at his lips. They'll be okay, he whispered to himself, watching until the car disappeared down the long driveway. Ellen sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The evening shadows lengthened across the farmhouse living room as Ben sat motionless, staring at the empty crib. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his eyes held a distant look. The silence felt heavy, almost tangible without the soft coos and gurgles that had filled the house these past weeks. Ellen watched her father from the kitchen doorway, her heart aching at his obvious pain. She made 2 cups of tea, adding honey the way he liked it, and carried them carefully to the living room. Settling beside him on the old couch, she offered him a cup without speaking. Several minutes passed in shared silence before Ellen gathered her courage. Dad, she began softly, her voice slightly trembling. I think we need to talk about some things. Ben turned to look at her, his eyes questioning. After Mom died, Ellen continued, twisting her hands in her lap, you just disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. It was like losing both parents at once. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. Ben's shoulders slumped as he set his tea down. Ellen, Please let me finish, she said gently. I was so angry for so long. I needed my father, but you weren't there. That's why I became a social worker, you know. I wanted to help people who felt as lost and alone as I did back then. Ben's face crumpled with regret. I thought... He paused, struggling to find the words. I thought if I kept my distance, you wouldn't have to deal with my grief too. I was drowning in it, Ellen. I didn't know how to be there for you when I could barely keep myself together. But that's just it, Dad, Ellen replied, tears welling in her eyes. We could have helped each other. Instead, we both suffered alone. Ben reached for Ellen's hand, his own trembling slightly. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I was wrong. These past weeks with the babies, seeing you in action, seeing your strength and compassion, it made me realize how much I missed, how much I let slip away. Ellen squeezed his hand. We got a second chance, didn't we? With the babies, with each other. We did, Ben nodded, his voice rough with emotion. Watching you with those babies, seeing the woman you've become despite my mistakes. I'm so proud of you, Ellen. I should have told you that years ago. Ellen leaned against her father's shoulder like she used to do as a little girl. I'm proud of you too, Dad. What you did for those babies, how you protected them. That's the father I remember from when I was young. Ben wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I love you, sweetheart. I always have, even when I didn't show it. I love you too, Dad, Ellen whispered, holding his hand tightly. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I'm proud of you, Dad, for everything you've done, for the babies, for me, and for yourself. They embraced, years of unspoken words and buried pain finally finding release in their shared tears and quiet understanding. The morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges as Ben stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt unburdened, like he could breathe more freely. The cornfield swayed gently in the morning breeze, reminding him of those first mysterious cries that had changed everything. After finishing his coffee, Ben changed into a clean plaid shirt and headed into town. The local sheriff's office was quiet when he walked in, just Deputy Miller at the front desk shuffling papers. What can I do for you, Ben? The deputy asked, looking up from his work. Need to speak with Sheriff Thompson, Ben replied, his voice firm with purpose. It's about human trafficking in our community. The sheriff welcomed Ben into his office, listening intently as Ben shared his experience. You know, Sheriff Thompson said, leaning forward in his chair, there's a group in town doing good work with survivors. Name's Hope Harbor. They're always looking for support. Ben nodded, taking the business card the sheriff offered. Within an hour, he was sitting across from Sarah Mitchell, Hope Harbor's director, in their modest downtown office. Mr. Carter, your farm could be exactly what we need, Sarah explained, her eyes bright with possibility. Many survivors need a quiet place to heal, somewhere away from the city. Ben drove home with his mind racing with ideas. The barn could be converted into additional living space. The spare rooms upstairs could house families. The vegetable garden could be expanded. Ellen was working on her laptop when he returned. She looked up, surprised by the energy in his step. Dad, everything okay? Ben settled into his favorite chair, sharing his morning's discoveries and the possibility of transforming their farm into a sanctuary. Ellen's eyes widened as he spoke, and then softened with understanding. It's perfect, she said simply. Where do we start? They spent the afternoon taking inventory of the house, making lists of needed repairs and supplies. Ellen suggested converting the nursery into a children's playroom. Ben measured the barn's interior, sketching plans for renovation. As they worked, Ben felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The empty rooms that had once echoed with loneliness would soon offer shelter to those who needed it most. Standing in what would become the main gathering space, Ben ran his hand along the weathered wooden wall. This farm has always been a home, he said quietly to Ellen. It's about time we share it with those who need one. Ellen smiled, understanding that her father had found his purpose. The farm that had once been his refuge from the world would now become a refuge for others. Ellen sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open before her, reading the email for the third time. The prestigious nonprofit organization, Guardians Against Trafficking, wanted her to lead their victim advocacy program in Colorado. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the details of the offer. Ben noticed her expression as he walked in from his morning farm duties. "Everything all right?" he asked, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I got a job offer," Ellen said quietly. "A big one. They want me to head up their victim advocacy program in Denver." Ben pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. "Tell me about it." Ellen turned the laptop so he could see. "They said my work with the babies case caught their attention. The position would let me help coordinate rescue operations and support services across multiple states." She paused, watching his face carefully. "But Dad, it's in Colorado. I'd have to move." Ben was quiet for a moment, studying the email. "Sounds like important work." "It is, but..." Ellen's voice cracked slightly. "After everything we've been through, getting close again, I don't want to leave you alone." Ben reached across the table and took her hand. "Ellen, honey, listen to me. I'm not alone anymore. This farm's becoming a place of healing for others. The advocacy group keeps me busy, and I've got good people around me now." He squeezed her hand. "You've got to follow your heart on this one." Tears welled up in Ellen's eyes. "But what if..." "No what ifs," Ben interrupted gently. "You've spent your whole life helping others. This is your chance to do even more good. I couldn't be prouder of you." Ellen wiped her eyes with her free hand. "You really think I should take it?" "I know you should," Ben said firmly. "Besides, Denver's not that far. You can visit whenever you want, and I might even learn how to use that video chat thing you keep telling me about." Ellen laughed through her tears. "You mean FaceTime?" "That's the one," Ben smiled. "We'll figure it out." Over the next hour, they discussed the details of the position. Ellen's excitement grew as she talked about the possibility of helping more trafficking survivors, while Ben listened attentively, offering supportive comments and practical advice. Later that afternoon, they stood together on the front porch looking out over the farm. The cornfield where Ben had found the babies stretched out before them, golden in the late-day sun. Ellen leaned against the porch railing, taking in the familiar sight. "No matter where I go, this will always be home," she said softly. The autumn breeze rustled through the cornfield as Ben stepped onto the farmhouse porch, watching the small group of women tending to the vegetable garden. His heart swelled with purpose seeing them working together, their hands busy in the rich soil. The farm had transformed over the past few months into something he never imagined, a place of healing and hope. Clara stood slightly apart from the others, her thin frame hunched over as she carefully planted seedlings. Her long, dark hair fell forward, hiding her face like a protective curtain. Ben recognized that defensive posture. He'd seen it in himself after losing his wife. "Would you like to help me check on the chickens?" he called out to her gently. Clara glanced up, hesitant, but nodded and made her way over. As they walked to the chicken coop, Ben kept his movements slow and predictable. "You've got a natural touch with those plants," he said. "My wife used to say some people just have green fingers." A ghost of a smile crossed Clara's face. "My grandmother had a garden," she whispered. It was the most she'd spoken since arriving 3 days ago. In the following weeks, Clara began to open up more, especially during their morning farm routines. She shared fragments of her story, being lured away from her small hometown with promises of modeling work, the nightmare that followed, her eventual escape. Ben listened without judgment, offering quiet support and steady presence. His phone rang one evening as he sat on the porch. "How are things going, Dad?" Ellen's warm voice came through. She called almost every day now, their relationship stronger than ever. "Getting better," he replied, watching Clara teach another survivor how to collect eggs. "Clara's really coming out of her shell. Reminds me of you at that age. Strong, but needs someone to believe in her." "You're good at that," Ellen said, believing in people. We should talk about expanding the program. The nonprofit I'm working with has more survivors needing safe places." Ben smiled, remembering how uncertain he'd felt when this all began. "I think we could handle a few more. The women help each other heal. Clara's proof of that." They discussed logistics and funding opportunities, Ellen's expertise in social services complementing Ben's practical farming knowledge. The farm was becoming more than just a sanctuary. It was a model for rural rehabilitation programs. One morning, Ben found Clara already up, confidently directing the morning chores. She'd organized a schedule for feeding animals and tending the garden. Her shoulders were straight, her voice clear and sure. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she told him as they watched the sunrise together. "But this place, it gives us all a chance to remember who we are." Ben nodded, thinking of the frightened babies that had started it all, how protecting them had led him here. The farm hummed with activity behind them. Voices chatting, chickens clucking, life moving forward. This was exactly what the farm was meant to be. The crisp autumn morning filled the farmhouse kitchen with golden light as Ben sat at the worn wooden table, his coffee steaming beside a stack of paperwork. The sounds of life echoed through the house, women chatting as they prepared for the upcoming community gathering, pots clanking in the kitchen, footsteps on creaky floorboards. It felt right, this new purpose the farm had found. His phone buzzed and Ellen's name lit up the screen. "Hey, Dad," she said warmly when he answered. "Just checking in during my lunch break." "Perfect timing," Ben replied, settling back in his chair. "How's the new job?" "Busy but good. We just helped place 3 more survivors in safe housing," Ellen shared, her voice filled with determination. "And I'm working on expanding our outreach program." As they talked, Ben heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, the mail carrier making their morning rounds. Through the window, he watched Clara collect the mail, her movements more confident now than when she first arrived at the farm. She brought the stack inside, placing it carefully on the table. "Hold on a second, Ellen," Ben said, noticing a pale blue envelope among the bills. His heart quickened as he recognized the return address. It was from the foster family who had adopted the babies. With slightly trembling fingers, Ben opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper thick and cream-colored. "It's from the baby's foster family," he told Ellen, who went quiet on the other end of the line. "Dear Mr. Carter," he read aloud, his voice catching slightly. "We wanted to write and express our deepest gratitude for everything you and Ellen did to protect these precious children. They have brought such joy into our lives, and we never forget the courage it took to keep them safe." Ben paused, unfolding 3 glossy photographs that had been tucked into the letter. The babies, no longer tiny infants but sturdy toddlers, beamed at the camera, their faces bright with happiness. They wore matching overalls, playing in a sunny backyard. "Oh, Dad," Ellen whispered through the phone, "how do they look?" "Beautiful," Ben managed, touching one photo gently. "So healthy and happy." He continued reading the letter, sharing with Ellen how the children had started walking, their first words, their favorite toys. The foster parents described their infectious laughter, their loving bond with each other, their growing personalities. They promised to send regular updates and more photos as the children grew. "They'll never forget what you did for them," Ellen said softly. "None of us will." Ben stood slowly, carrying the photos to the living room mantel. He arranged them carefully next to the family photos already there. Ellen's graduation picture, an old photo of his late wife, recent snapshots of the women who had found refuge at the farm. Looking at the smiling faces of the 3 children who had changed everything, Ben touched the frame gently. "You'll always be a part of this home," he said quietly, his heart full. Through the phone, he could hear Ellen sniffling slightly. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the photos and casting a gentle glow across the room. In the kitchen, the sounds of preparation for the community gathering continued, a reminder of how much had changed, how much good had come from that foggy morning when he first heard those faint cries in his cornfield. The morning sun painted the farm in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the freshly tilled fields. Ben stood on his weathered porch, coffee mug warming his hands as he watched the day begin. The farm had transformed over the past year, no longer a place of isolation, but a sanctuary buzzing with hope and healing. Women moved purposefully through the gardens, some harvesting vegetables while others tended to new plantings. Their quiet conversations and occasional laughter drifted across the property. Ben smiled, remembering how silent these fields had once been. Clara, who had arrived 6 months ago barely able to make eye contact, now confidently directed a small group in the herb garden. Her voice carried clearly as she explained the proper way to transplant seedlings. The change in her still amazed him. The crunch of tires on gravel caught his attention. A familiar car pulled up, and Ben's heart lifted as Ellen stepped out, her professional clothes a stark contrast to the casual farm atmosphere. "Surprise!" she called out, grinning as she walked toward him. Ben set down his coffee and met her halfway, wrapping her in a tight hug. "What are you doing here?" "Took a few days off," Ellen said, stepping back to look around. "Dad, this place, it's incredible. I can hardly believe how different it looks." They walked the property together, Ellen's hand tucked in the crook of Ben's arm like when she was young. The vegetable gardens had expanded and new flower beds added splashes of color everywhere. Several women waved as they passed. "Remember how quiet it used to be?" Ellen asked softly. "Now look at it. So full of life." Clara approached them, her smile bright. "Ellen, we didn't know you were coming." She hugged Ellen warmly. "Your father has been such a blessing to all of us. He's helped me find strength I didn't know I had." Ellen squeezed Ben's arm, her eyes glistening. "I'm so proud of you, Dad. What you've created here, it's beautiful." They made their way back to the porch, settling into the old rocking chairs. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces as they caught up on each other's lives. Ben listened to Ellen's stories about her work, his heart full of pride at the difference she was making. A burst of laughter from the gardens caught their attention, and Ben smiled, remembering other laughter. 3 tiny babies who had changed everything. The memory no longer brought pain, only gratitude for the path they had set him on. "Those babies," he said quietly. "They really were miracles." Ellen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "They were. And look what came from it. All of this." She gestured to the thriving farm around them. Ben watched the survivors working in the gardens, their movements confident and peaceful. "Miracles really do come at a cost," he said softly. "But they're worth it." If you enjoyed the story of Ben, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.